Thank you for joining this episode of our webinar series on best practices in digital risk management and cybersecurity. Today's session is focused on mitigating the escalating threat of business email compromise. If you haven't joined us before, our webinars take place monthly and cover the latest threats, trends, and best practices in digital risk management and cybersecurity. You'll find a listing of live and on-demand events on digitalshadows.com. A few housekeeping rules before we get started. Your phones will be muted for the duration of the webcast to prevent background noise from interfering with the speakers today. To submit a question for our presenters, please type it into the Q&A panel found on the Event Center console. If you have any issues with audio or video, please email us at info@digitalshadows.com and we'll address that right away. Joining us today are two experts on this topic. Our first presenter is Dean Kinsman. He's a supervisory special agent at the FBI Memphis Nashville Cyber Division. Dean started his career with the FBI in the Detroit field office in 2002 as a cybercrime agent. From 2002 to 2009, he investigated criminal and national security computer intrusion cases in the Detroit field office. From 2009 to 2011, he was assigned to FBI headquarters in the Cyber Division and participated in several coordinated multinational searches and arrests of international cyber subjects. In February of 2012, he moved to the FBI Nashville Resident Agency to investigate cybercrime and became the supervisor of the Cybercrime Squad in May of 2017. Prior to joining the FBI, Dean worked as a system administrator and desktop support manager for Perot Systems Corporation in Raleigh, North Carolina. He is a 1993 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and served as a lieutenant in the Navy on a destroyer homeported in San Diego, California. Joining Dean is Rafael Amado. He's a senior strategy and research analyst for Digital Shadows. His work has been featured in international media and the industry press. His extensive research spans areas that include the WannaCry attacks, how organizations and individuals can combat the spread of disinformation and fake news, and trends within the cybercriminal ecosystem. He is also the co-host of the Digital Shadows podcast, Shadow Talk, which you'll also find on digitalshadows.com. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dean Kinsman. Dean?
Thank you very much. Again, my name is Dean Kinsman. I'm a supervisory special agent. I'm in Nashville with the FBI, and I supervise the Cybercrime Squad. We're a small squad dedicated to computer intrusion investigations. We only have 5 agents here dedicated to the investigation, and we cover the whole area of computer intrusions, which is both national security computer intrusions and criminal. So today we're primarily going to talk about the business email compromise. And unfortunately, by far, the business email compromise is the largest financial threat to both small businesses and organizations. The rise of this type of compromise has been astronomical. Since 2013, the FBI has identified victims from over 131 countries and over $5 billion in losses. Unfortunately, the losses are probably much, much higher than those figures because those are simply figures that have been reported to the FBI. It's much likely higher because of reporting to other agencies or simply from victims that haven't reported it and don't know where to report it. And it continues to happen just because it's a simple type of intrusion or fraud that almost anybody with almost no technical ability can pull off. So it's highly effective because it's simple. Locally in our office here in Nashville, we probably are receiving 3 to 4 reports per week from victims, and most of them range from about $100,000 to one last week that we had was $900,000 in 2 transfers. Most of the transfers or the targets are from small businesses, and then also we're seeing it from title companies. So I'm going to start with a quick overview of the BEC and how we as the FBI are seeing this occur in our area. In step 1, we see the targets being identified by the subjects, generally overseas. For the most part, these started as West African groups. But now we've seen it spread everywhere, the subjects all over the world, all over Europe, and even into South America. First of all, in the first step, they're identifying the target. Organized crime groups target U.S. and European businesses, exploiting information available online to develop a profile on the company and the executives. And then we see in step 2, where where they will start a spear phishing campaign. And this spear phishing campaign is designed through telephone calls or targeted emails to target company officials, generally someone who has access to the financials of the company, either a chief financial officer or even in the case of a small business, it may be the bank itself. And the spear phishes can take a couple of different forms. One, it's generally to get credentials, to try to obtain those credentials through simple spear phishing emails that may or may not have malware. Lately, we have been seeing more instances of malicious software malware being used in a keylogger, simple keyloggers, in order to obtain credentials. Or those targeted phishing emails may be just a lookalike email. So let's say, for example, the domain name for my company is FBI.gov. Instead of an I and FBI, the subjects may change that to an FB1.gov. And to most victims, they wouldn't realize that it's actually just a spoofed email or a lookalike and wouldn't recognize such a small change as that. In step 3, we see the exchange of information. So once the subject has convinced the victim that they are someone with authorization to execute a wire transfer, they'll then send an email to the targeted victim, trying to convince them to send a wire transfer out. And then in step 4, what we're seeing is the actual wire transfer. And this is where they get into money laundering, which is a whole nother portion of this crime, how it is truly an organized group. Generally, the money launderers are an entire separate organization than the individuals committing the spear phishing or lookalike attacks themselves. So the way we're seeing this played out, as an example, let's say, for example, I'm a company, I'm a vendor, and my company sells widgets, and our domain name is widgets.com. So the subjects will intrude into my email account in order to determine who my customers are. Once they're in there, they will send a phishing email or send an email to that victim requesting payment for the widgets that I provided. Many times what we see once they get into the email, that they'll set up a forwarding rule on the victim's email account that they intruded into, so that they can create a lookalike domain, and then all email correspondence with that victim who they're trying to entice a wire transfer out of at that point will be with a lookalike. Therefore, the victim themselves is not aware that the email has been intruded upon, and the conversation is continuing as the victim is being groomed in order to entice a wire transfer out. So in cases where the credentials are actually compromised, what we're going to talk about next is how are they actually getting the credentials. And so this is a phishing page from a case that we worked here in the Nashville office. I was the original case agent on this case. And this was a very simple Western African group. And what they were doing is they started the credential compromise by buying them on the darknet. Once they got into the victim's email account, they would send them an email, or send an email to all the contacts in the victim's account, saying that if they wanted to see some properties for sale online, they could just click on the link in the email, and then they could view the properties. And then once they clicked on the link, it would bring up a phishing page. And this is one of those simple phishing pages that was rendered at that point. And it tells them to access their online secured auction page. You're required to choose your email address below. Once they clicked on their email provider, it just brought them to a splash page, which would then ask for their username and password to their email. Once we looked at the HTML, you could see it was a simple script that was collecting usernames and passwords from the victims and then just sending them on to Gmail accounts. Once we executed a search warrant on those particular Gmail accounts that were being used, there were hundreds of thousands of victim credentials being harvested from a very simple phishing site. And it just continues from there, because now every single person that clicks and provides credentials, now the victim or the subject can get into the victim's account and continuing the fraud by sending more phishing emails onto victims and all of the contact lists that they're continuing to harvest. One of the other ways that we're seeing credentials being compromised is simply by social media. And this is something that Mark Zuckerberg was aware of, is that people have gotten comfortable not only sharing more information in different kinds, but more openly and with more people. A social norm is something that has evolved over time. So we're all used to using social media, and in this case, we're picking on Facebook a little bit, but that's just one of the many social media sites in where people are comfortable just providing information about themselves. And from that information, sometimes the subjects can glean a password from that information. They can determine who they're doing business with in order to craft a lookalike email, or even get into the account itself by guessing the password. So many times we encourage people to simply not provide as much information, personal information, on social media accounts, a good way to avoid becoming compromised. And then once in the step 4 or 3, when we talked about before, the actual wire transfer, this is one of the phishing emails, just an example where we're seeing the phishing email going to the victim, requesting a wire transfer be processed, and of course the wire transfer instructions in the attachment are instructions for an account in which the subject controls and then can receive the wire transfer in that manner. So once the wire transfer is initiated, then the subjects have to launder the money. And this is where we sort of see organized cyber criminals have now engaged. Now criminals are involved in money laundering. And this is a money laundering website. This was one that the FBI took down several years ago, but a very legitimate looking website in which cyber criminals will recruit unwitting money mules to receive money into the bank accounts. Individuals that have posted their resume online looking for work-at-home jobs will get recruited by cyber criminals who are trying to launder money from criminals such as the BEC compromised hackers. So in this case, once they're hired, the money mules will go to a website such as this in which they can log into, and they can see instructions about money they will receive, packages they will receive, all under the guise that they believe they are working for a legitimate company. Unfortunately, many of the people that sign up for this type of job who believe they're working for a legitimate company often become victims of identity theft themselves, because they will fill out a job application in which they will provide many times their driver's license, their passport, their social security number if they live in the U.S., any sort of information that an employer might gather in order to hire someone to work for their company. So very organized scheme. One of the other ways we're seeing, particularly in BECs, is we are seeing the West African groups are recruiting through romance money mule schemes. So they will recruit and groom them through romance schemes, make the individual believe that they're involved in some sort of romantic relationship, and then tell them that they're overseas and they need to receive money from their clients and ask them to transfer the money. And then these unwitting individuals are unknowingly involved in transferring money received from victims to the subjects then overseas. So moving on to our next screen, what we're going to talk about is what do you do if you become a victim? And unfortunately, this has become more of a when instead of an if situation. We used to say if, but now unfortunately we're saying when you become a victim, what do you do? So what's happened in cyber is this problem has become so prolific, not just from BEC, but from other compromise too as well, such as point of sale, compromises, account takeovers, and ransomware, that we created the Internet Crime Complaint Center several years ago. And it's a partnership between the FBI and the National White Collar Crime Center, in which victims can report victimization of crime online in an online form. It's a simple form that they fill out where they can describe what happened, provide any information that they know of about the victim, and then that information is collated by analysts who would then get all the information and try to put all of the complaints from victims that are worldwide into one location where one FBI field office can then be assigned to investigate the matter. And they've become very good at doing this. This is a very valuable resource to agents in the field, because I receive emails all the time from IC3 from victims in which they say they think there's either a subject or multiple victims in my area, and therefore we should open and investigate a case, and then we will open a case from that point on. One other way that they can also contact the FBI is through the public access line, or PAL line, and that number is simply 1-800-CALL-FBI. We encourage victims to use that resource too as well. And also our outreach mechanisms such as InfraGard is a very popular way. If you become an InfraGard member, you can sign up at infragard.org and apply to become an InfraGard member. And regularly the FBI will come and present, and it's also a good networking opportunity for those in the business and IT industry in order to get to know the FBI and other people in your particular industry. So a couple of the initiatives that I want to talk about that the FBI is using to address the problem with BEC is, number one, the financial fraud kill chain. This was started a couple of years ago, and this allows a victim who have become a victim of the business email compromise or any other fraudulent wire transfer to try to stop that money transfer when it goes overseas. So usually what happens in these type of cases is when the money goes overseas, the victim will contact IC3. They will fill out an online form, and once IC3 finds these and determines that the victim is overseas, or the recipient bank account is overseas, they will ask that the victim initiate a financial fraud kill chain. So that IC3 report will be sent to a field office, such as here in the Nashville office. I'll receive them in my email. I'm asked to initiate a financial fraud kill chain. I have the victim's contact information because the victim filled it out, and I will then contact the victim over the phone. I will send them the kill chain form. It's a few information, a little bit about what happened to the victim. I then send it to several of my contacts and my counterparts who are overseas. Then our counterpart law enforcement agencies that are overseas will then go freeze the funds. In this, a couple of examples we've had recently, we had one last week for $900,000. The victim got a hold of us very quickly, and within 30 minutes we were able to reverse that transfer, and the money all came back to the victim here in Nashville. In another one, we had a high-profile victim in this area that was traveling overseas in a hotel, used unsecured wireless in the hotel, and the victim subject was able to get into the victim's account and initiate a BEC fraudulent email to the victim's accountant, and then transferred $300,000 overseas. They got a hold of IC3. We initiated a financial fraud kill chain, and were able to recover that money in about an hour back to the victim. There's a couple of caveats in order to use the financial fraud kill chain. Number one, there must be at least $50,000 in loss that went overseas. Number two, the loss must occur from an organization. It can't occur from an individual. Many times it could be from a charity organization that an individual runs, and that sort of thing is fine. It just has to come from an organization. And it has to have occurred within the last 72 hours. This is very important because the subjects overseas know that when money gets transferred overseas, that they must withdraw the money quickly, either in cash or then transfer it on to other recipient subjects' accounts that are overseas. So we always emphasize, within less than 72 hours. We are seeing a lot of these transfers in the financial fraud kill chain. When they are initiated, they're going to Hong Kong. And the reason is because the banking system in Hong Kong is very business friendly. Therefore, it's very easy to open an account in Hong Kong for the subjects. And so many of those transfers are going there. Luckily, many of these transfers we have been able to get reversed through the financial fraud kill chain. Just be aware to victims that money that goes overseas, sometimes it's reversed, but if it's not, it will be frozen by the recipient subject bank, and then the victim is required to get legal representation in Hong Kong in order to have the money returned. And many times in Hong Kong, it can be very expensive to obtain an attorney. One of the ways that we're combating this is through the IC3, or Internet Crime Complaint Center, RAT, and RAT is the Recovery Access Team. And the recovery team is a group of analysts who are reviewing all of these IC3 complaints that come in, and they work with our domestic banks in order to recover or freeze funds that are sent to money mules domestically, who are then instructed by the subjects to then wire the transfer the money overseas. This has been a very successful initiative. Within the past 2 months, the RAT team has recovered 77% of all the transfers going domestically have been frozen and then returned to the victims. So it's been very successful, and I highly encourage victims, if they do become a victim, to report it immediately to IC3. And then one of the other ways is just good investigative work. Recently in June of this year, Operation WireWire was heavily publicized by the FBI. And this is which 74 individuals in the U.S. were arrested and 29 in Nigeria, also in Canada and Poland were arrested. Several of these are being extradited, and in this particular case, there was $14 million that was frozen and $2.4 million that was actually seized and returned back to the victims. Here in our own division, the Memphis division, I'm in the Nashville office for the Memphis division. We have a very good case being worked by agents in Memphis in which they have charged 13 individuals have been indicted within the United States. 9 of them have been arrested, and 2 of them are being extradited from Ghana. Our investigative agents went to Ghana to work with the National Police of Ghana to execute the arrest of these 2 high-profile organized cybercrime individuals, and they are now in the process of coming back to the United States for prosecution. And finally, our FBI Legal Attaché program. Legal attachés are FBI agents who work in the overseas embassies. Right now, we have FBI agents in 64 overseas embassies. And because cyber has become such a prolific problem overseas, that we have also put FBI cyber-trained agents in 20 of these 64 legal attachés. We are expected to expand that number of cyber-trained agents dramatically in the next couple of years, possibly even doubling that amount over the next several years, just to get more FBI-trained agents working overseas, working with their foreign counterparts to help to combat that problem. So how to avoid becoming a victim of the business email compromise? Number 1, implement a complex email password policy. This is a password that should be changed every 90 days at a minimum, and at least 12 characters with a complex character combination of uppercase, lowercase numbers, and also symbols too as well. Require those email password changes, as we discussed, at least every 90 days. Change your password, and limit the information that you provide on social media and websites about yourself, not only about who you might possibly be doing business, but also information that a subject could use to possibly guess a password. And finally, we encourage everyone to enable multi-factor authentication on email. If that option is provided, please enable that option. That will eliminate a large portion of what we're seeing in the business email compromise of those people becoming victims. So that is all I have right now. At this point, I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Thanks, Dean. That was a great presentation. And now I'll turn it over to Rafael Amado. Rafael?
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you, Dean. As mentioned before, I'm Rafael Amado. I work for Digital Shadows. So Digital Shadows is a digital risk protection company, and as well as providing digital risk protection services, we provide the latest threat intelligence and also remediation on the latest cyber threats to all our customers. So for the remainder of this webinar, I'll be going into a little more detail on the specific techniques used to perform business email compromise attacks. So I'll cover recent developments in the threat landscape, mainly the use of malware, which Dean mentioned, and then we'll end with some mitigation recommendations for preventing this sort of attack, which would complement some of the tips that Dean gave as well. So there are roughly 4 broad variations of the business email compromise attack. Recently, however, we've also started seeing cases of a 5th variant, which doesn't focus on stealing funds. Instead, it's about obtaining confidential tax documents, such as tax information from accounting departments. And I'll be going through each of these in a bit more detail in the following section. So as I said, there are traditionally 4 variations of the business email compromise attack. We have what we call here the supplier swindle, which may also be known as the bogus invoice scam. And this usually involves an attacker impersonating a supplier and then sending a fake invoice to trick a target into making a fraudulent payment. Now, the second type of attack is CEO or whaling fraud. And that involves an attacker impersonating a CEO to request information or the transfer of funds from another employee. Then we have employee compromise, which is when an employee's account is compromised and used to send fake requests or information or transferring funds to the attacker. And finally, we have the attorney or lawyer impersonation. Now, this is when an attacker poses as an administrative or legal representative and requests access to sensitive or confidential documents. Now, what's important to remember here is that these are broad categories and there's many variations of each of these scams, but most of the scams you'll see will fall under one of these groups. Another one would be real estate fraud, which can also fall into one of the above categories. In certain situations, attackers might even combine 2 of these together. Now, I'll go through each of these just to give you some real-world examples for each of one. Now, I'm a big football fan, so this isn't the only football reference you'll receive in this webinar, but this example really underlines how even large organizations can easily fall victim to business email compromise. So earlier this year, the Italian football club Lazio received an email from who they thought was a representative from a Dutch club, requesting that the final installment on a player they had bought be paid. Now, this email contained banking details and was written in the format of an invoice, which made it seem legitimate, and Lazio officials willingly transferred 2 million euros to the scammers, which obviously made a lot of headlines and caused some reputational damage as well as financial losses. So, CEO and whaling fraud. In the example on the right here, we've got the Austrian aerospace company FACC Operations, who lost 50 million euros after a scammer contacted the accounting department claiming to be a company executive. Now, this event had significant reputational impact on the company, with the stock price value diving after news of the attack was first released. And in the clipping on the left, we've got the owner of the French industrial company Etna Industrie. In this attack, an Etna account received a phone call telling them that they would soon receive an email from the company president and that they would be given specific instructions on how to conduct a confidential transaction. So you can see in this case, the attackers pressurized the accountant into acting quickly to achieve their objective, as well as creating a realistic email spoof of the president of the company. Now, in less than an hour, the accountants authorized wire transfers totaling over $540, which were paid into foreign bank accounts. In the previous 2 examples were cases where victims received emails from accounts from CEOs or other executives at their company. However, there are many cases where business email compromise attempts follow from actual intrusions into company networks and their accounts. And many of these involve attackers gaining access to an employee's legitimate email account and then using this to send emails to accounting departments, which is what Dean talked about earlier in terms of using compromised credentials, selling on the dark web, or even a network intrusion. So obviously this makes it harder for victims to detect, as they have less reason to distrust the email from a legitimate employee. Now, in the attack on screen, which infected an investment company in Michigan, staff received an email from a legitimate, albeit compromised account belonging to a co-worker, and were able to siphon off around about $500,000. And the final category of traditional business email compromise involves an attacker impersonating a lawyer or some sort of representative. So one high-profile case occurred last year, and this affected Twinem Agricultural Group. And the founder of Twinem received an email from a fraudster claiming to be the administrator of his personal finances. And in the end, he lost over $1 million through this email scam. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is a 5th category of business email compromise that has risen in prominence in recent years. And these are data theft attacks, where HR and finance departments are targeted to obtain personal and financial information. And this includes W-2 tax data, forms, and this is all done rather than making wire transfer requests. Now, tax information, forms, and employee tax data has many uses for cyber criminals, including selling it on forums and marketplaces to other criminals, or using it for identity fraud. Now, this is a screenshot as an example of a Russian language criminal forum user, and you can see the user here is offering to sell W-2 and 1040 tax forms with full information included. Now, this is likely to be of interest to anyone looking to perform tax fraud. Likewise, if we search for other criminal and dark web locations for mentions of W-2 and tax forms, we see countless examples of buyers and sellers communicating with each other. In this example from Dark Pro, which is a criminal forum, which we managed to access using the Digital Shadows portal, where you can search across all these different cybercriminal locations, we can see the seller Ghost 007 offering W-2 forms for use in tax refund scams. Now, notably, the user also claims to have access to all the relevant information you need for this type of tax fraud, which includes the employer and the employee details, social security numbers, and even wage statements, which you can see there in the advertisement. And finally, here are some examples from different marketplaces where stolen W-2 forms and payment stubs are being openly advertised. So all in all, the overall picture here is that there is a market for tax documents, and business email compromise attacks are being used in order to obtain this type of information and then sell it on. So traditionally, business email compromise attacks haven't used malware or tools to achieve their aims, but this is something that we're seeing more regularly now, as Dean mentioned. I mean, in the past, attackers have relied on social engineering techniques to trick their victims into transferring funds. But if we look at the threat landscape in 2018, we see more and more attackers are using malware-laden phishing emails to compromise an initial target, to gain access to email accounts, and from there they can then stage their business email compromise attempts. So one example we have is a collective of predominantly Nigeria-based threat actors, which have been given the name Silver Terrier by vendors. And they've delivered attacks using information stealing malware and remote access Trojans against targets in multiple sectors. So they've deployed 15 commodity malware families in an average of 17,600 attacks per month. The malware included information stealers and remote access Trojans, which are known as RATs, and these include Lockybot, Zeus, and Luminosity Link. The tools are all available for purchase at relatively low costs on criminal forums and marketplaces. And the second example, we've got the Malhide malware, which represents a relatively new tactic for business email compromise. The way this malware works is it's embedded within macro-enabled Microsoft Word documents, so attachments that you might receive in an email, and then they're used to create an SMTP service on an infected machine. Now, this SMTP client, what it does is it downloads email addresses and then sends fraudulent emails to victims in a relay process. Now, this screenshot on the right shows the sort of phishing page or the phishing email that was sent out to victims. And basically, if you then enable content on the attachment, that will basically start executing the malware. In this section, I'm going to break down the two most common methods of business email compromise attack, which Dean also touched on previously. We'll go into it into a bit more granular detail, and that will help us draw out the ways organizations and individuals can prevent or identify these attacks in their infancy. So we've got the more traditional method, the more simple one, so email-only attacks. Now, these spoof an individual or a company. They almost solely rely on social engineering, and they're often highly targeted and involve a lot of initial reconnaissance. And then the second method, which we're seeing more and more, is the credential compromise, which Dean talked about a bit more. So these use phishing kits, normally keyloggers, and information stealing malware. And then these credentials are then used to access email accounts from which the fraudulent requests are then submitted. So method one, as you can see, you start with some initial reconnaissance on your target or your business. This can be done on social media, LinkedIn, company websites. Then the attacker will usually register a fake domain. They will then send a spoof email from that domain. They will contact the target requesting a transfer of funds using social engineering techniques to make it seem believable. And then finally, the target will initiate the transfer of funds. Now, as Dean mentioned, there's this whole issue of online exposure and oversharing, which can make you a victim of business email compromise. So attackers often perform reconnaissance on their targets before launching their attacks. Now, we'll come back to this in the mitigation section, but the information available on social media posted online by employees can constitute a risk that attackers can exploit. So you may have examples where VIPs or executives overshare on social media. One thing that's becoming more common is the case of high-ranking members of your organization telling people that they're away or that they're not in the office at the minute. Now, for example, on the left, we've got a very famous CEO from a famous technology company advertising their recent holiday in Norway. Now, in this example, Amazon haven't been compromised by a business email compromise attack. This is just an example of how commonplace these type of posts are. But if you look at it from a attacker's point of view, the attacker can basically then take this information and know, okay, I can email people in this organization and socially engineer them with this information. You can send an email to employees being like, oh, I'm on a beach right now, so I'm using my Gmail. This is why it's not coming from my company account, but can you do X, Y, and Z and transfer funds to this person? You can see how that can play out. Now, the other side of VIP exposure involves spoof or parody VIP social media profiles. So a fraudster will impersonate a high-level executive, performing reconnaissance by speaking to their connections, by going on LinkedIn and seeing, creating relationships with other employees in the company, for example. Now, in this example, you've got someone posing as a CEO at a large company. However, they've only got 2 connections. So this is an example of a social media profile where we would flag it as this is potentially not a real one. As we said before, another stage attackers use is registering domains, and we call this domain or typo squatting, depending on the technique that they're using. So once the fraudster has acquired all these pieces of information from their initial reconnaissance, they'll create an email account that looks legitimate using one of 2 strategies. So the first would be to register a domain similar to the company's, or the second one would be spoofing the genuine email address, which is when the attackers use a genuine email address but their own domain. And this example here is one that our proprietary system managed to find. So we have molnet.com with 1 L and 2 N's at the bottom there. We've got an impersonation of it with 2 L's. And the individual here has gone on to even create a web page from it. So this would have an email address attached to it, and you could easily see someone using that in a campaign. Now, the second more sophisticated method is the one that Dean alluded to. So initially you have the compromise of the company account, whether it's through stolen credentials from the dark web, phishing emails, or malware. Then you have the reconnaissance phase, so you profile the target company, but this is done from within the organization because you've actually got access to someone's mailbox, and you search that compromised mailbox for targets. You learn how money moves around, who are the right people I need to be communicating with, and then you start doing mailbox rules, which Dean alluded to. So you can set it up to forward messages to the attacker or even delete certain messages when they relate to targets on that list. Then you'd send an email impersonating the employee using that compromised account, requesting the wire transfer, and this process is then repeated. Because the attacker has access to this mailbox, they're able to basically rinse and repeat and go through this stage over and over again. So when we talk about mitigation, a combination of people, process, and technology is required. And like all defensive arts, this requires practice, dedication, and regular training. So we'd recommend the following considerations when you're thinking about mitigating against business email compromise. The first tactic that we talked about was reconnaissance, how actors are performing reconnaissance on their targets. So as Dean says, limiting overexposure is a really big one. Think about what you're exposing online. As an organization, you can conduct assessments of your executives' digital footprints. One simple initial measure you can do is just set up Google Alerts on specific individuals on your company to make sure that any mentions of them online that are indexed by Google are ones that you're comfortable with them being involved in. Then you've got domain and typo squat, so you can monitor for domain registrations. As soon as someone registers a domain that is similar to yours, you can be alerted to that. There's an open source piece of code called DNS Twist, and this can be used for exactly that purpose, and that's freely available online. Then in terms of phishing, this requires some employee awareness training, and there are many different email filtering measures and solutions out there which might be relevant to your organization in this capacity. And finally, credential compromise. So multi-factor or 2-factor authentication will go a long way to preventing those credentials being compromised in the first place. In terms of more training aspects, you should update your security awareness training content to include the business email compromise scenario. This should be included in new hire training, but you should also conduct ad hoc training for this scenario as soon as possible. Next, just as you built ransomware and destructive malware such as ransomware into your incident response or business continuity planning, you need to build business email compromise into your contingency plans as well. So you should organize a procedure for what employees should do if they receive an unusual or suspicious email asking them to authorize a transfer. You should develop a playbook for how you would deal with the unfortunate event of a scam actually occurring. I mean, think about how your team would respond. How do your accounts team respond? Do you have a PR plan in place? Do you have an incident response plan in place? Does everyone know their roles? That's what a playbook would look like. Next, and probably one of the most important ones, is working with your wire transfer application vendors. And here you need to build multiple person authorizations to approve significant wire transfers. You ideally need 2 people to approve a transaction. Now, this may seem like an arduous and slow task, which could slow some processes down, but I think you'll agree that the drawbacks of including this as an extra step in your day-to-day process far outweighs the reality of crippling your business through a multi-figure business email compromise attack. And finally, formalize an operations security or OPSEC program. Train your employees into how to stay safe online, the dangers of oversharing, of not sharing credentials across accounts or between users. So just to wrap up, a few key takeaways from what I've just discussed. The main one is there's 2 primary methods of attack. The first one is the email-only attacks that rely on social engineering to spoof an individual or company, and these require a lot of heavy reconnaissance initially by threat actors, so oversharing here is a really big thing that you should be concentrating on. The second one is the credential compromises, which will allow an attacker to control a legitimate account. They have access to your mailbox, and from there they can submit fraudulent requests. And in terms of mitigation, as I said, people, process, and technology, you need a mixture of all of these. Security awareness training for all your employees and the business email compromise playbook, multi-person authorizations in terms of wire transfers, 2-factor to mitigate credential compromise, and once again, monitoring for your executives and domain impersonations as well. Finally, from Digital Shadows, you can subscribe to get the latest threat intelligence information in your inbox through the following link there for our industry news and events. And we've also got a weekly podcast where we discuss the latest threat intelligence, as well as we have interviews with certain cybersecurity professionals in the field. So this will be useful for anyone interested in the latest cybersecurity developments. And I'll pass it back to Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks, Raphael. That was a great presentation. We had several questions come in during today's session. The first question that came in is, what is the most common BEC attack and any recommendations on how to prevent it? Dean and Raphael, I know both of you covered this. Dean, do you want to go ahead and start with this one?
Sure. The most common that we are seeing right now is credential compromise, in which it's normally a small to medium-sized business is what we're seeing, that are, engaged in a business transaction, usually with a vendor. And once they're in, then they'll set up the forwarding email once they can conduct some reconnaissance and find out who the victim that's been intruded upon is conducting business with, and who owes the money for a business transaction. They'll set up the forwarding email within the lookalike, or a lookalike within the victim's email account, and then continue the process that way. We have not seen in this area as much malware being used. It's normally just from the contact list from the victims, and then directing everybody in the contact list will receive a phishing email, just asking them, usually it could be a DocuSign document that they've received, asking them to click on it, and then in order to view it, they have to provide their email credentials, and then the process just continues from there. We do have a couple of cases now involving malware that is involved with West African groups, but the vast majority are these simple phishing scams with phishing websites not involving malware.
Great, thanks. Raphael, any added commentary on that one?
No, I'd support what Dean said there. I mean, before, as I said, the older method of heavily socially engineered attack was most commonplace, but in terms of what we're seeing right now as well is the preference for these credential compromise attacks. And they obviously have more benefits for for an attacker. If you actually have control of someone's account or their mailbox, you can use that as a pivot point to hit so many different targets, not just your actual organization where that account belongs to, but then also suppliers and third parties, anyone else who's ever contacted that mailbox.
And the next question, can you provide more detail on what the business email compromise playbook entails? Raphael, I believe this one's for you.
Sure. So I think it's a good way to look at it is think of it like a checklist. So let's say you're the unfortunate victim of a business email compromise attack. There's obviously all the stuff you can do beforehand, but let's say you have been attacked. How do you recover? How do you get back to business? How do you respond to that situation? So do you know the financial institution that you're meant to contact immediately once you realize what's happened? Do you know who's meant to make that contact? Who's the individual employee responsible for that? Do you know your local law enforcement office? Now, Dean gave in his presentation gave some useful numbers and tips in terms of who you need to call. The same thing as an organization, you need to know who you need to call in that situation. Do you have an incident response plan in place? Do you have the right technology to work out if something has gone wrong? Do your defenders know what they need to do? And then you need to be doing some post-mortem analysis as well. You need to assess why the attack was successful. And then from that, you need to revisit your training, revisit your processes and your controls, reassess your security posture. Do you have the right email security tools in place? Do you have the right training in place? Are you dealing with this in the right way? How could you prevent that the second time?
Thanks, Raphael. The next question, are there specific criteria for reporting an attack to the FBI? Dean, can you cover this one?
Yes, the first and most direct method is if you know your local FBI supervisor, the cybercrime squad, or just an agent on the squad locally. That's going to be the most direct route. And you can develop those relationships through infraguard.org as you get to know the agents that are in your local area. Secondly, if you don't, from a business email compromise, I highly recommend go to ic3.gov and fill out the form. Analysts are there 24/7 reviewing those submissions, and as they receive them, they then forward them on to an agent in the area who can address the crime and contact the victim right away. And then the third way would be from the FBI 1-800 number, which is 1-800-CALL-FBI. It's our call center in which specialists are online 24/7, can receive victim information, and then contact an agent in the area where the victim is in order to start an investigation.
And the last question that came in, what business risks do you see with business email compromise? Raphael, do you want to touch on this one?
Sure. So the obvious one is loss of funds. So the amount of money that the attackers are able to siphon away from you or your organization. Then you've got reputational risks, which we mentioned in the case of the company stock price being affected. So if investors, customers, and public lose trust in the company, this will lead to fewer investments, lower profit, especially if customers are put off. Then there's a loss of sensitive information, particularly in the case of tax details being extracted by attackers. And finally, there's again loss of funds, but this is more in respect to fines. So in the UK, where I'm based, for example, the Information Commissioner's Office will often investigate to see if you created conditions suitable for cybercrime and mishandling sensitive data. And in many jurisdictions around the world, you have similar types of bodies out there who will investigate, and you potentially be liable for fines if you have been deemed to have mishandled information or not had the proper checks and balances in place.
All right. Well, thanks, Dean, and thanks, Raphael, for great presentations today. And thanks to everyone attending today's session. Please watch your inbox for an invite to our next webinar on best practices in digital risk management and cybersecurity. Take care.